Welcome to the Dragon Soul Breakdown series. These breakdowns will give you a detailed insight into the Dragon Soul 10-man heroic encounters. In this video, I'll break down the Ultraxion fight so you have the tools to get the job done. During the guide, I'm going to cover the entire fight mechanically, as well as giving you a recipe for how to finish the encounter in its entirety. The fight is a one-phase encounter with very limited mechanics, and getting the kill will require you to weave in and out of the Twilight realm while performing a limited amount of tasks. The first thing you'll notice is that you'll have an extra action button on your interface. This button will be used to transition you from the Twilight realm back to the normal realm for 5 seconds. Some interface manipulating add-ons will remove this button, but regardless of your UI, I'd recommend that you use the following macro instead of clicking the button manually. The fight itself has a 6-minute hard and rage timer where your raid will be instantly wiped. The primary damage mechanic which needs to be healed is called Unstable Monstrosity. This mechanic causes Ultraxion to pulse raid-wide shadow damage every so often. At the start of the fight, this deals damage every 6 seconds, but the frequency is increased during the fight, which causes the end of the fight to be very hectic where Ultraxion deals high damage every second. To help you accommodate for the gradual increase in damage taken, you'll receive buffs on your healers and tanks throughout the raid. These buffs are applied and/or spawned at fixed times during the fight, so utilizing the buffs is critical to ensure your survival. The first buff is called the Last Defender of Azeroth. This will be applied to both tanks shortly after the encounter is started. Once applied, it halves any defensive cooldowns for the tanks and doubles their durations, so effective defensive use will help you a lot during the fight. The second buff is called Gift of Life. This will spawn 2 red crystals at the edge of the room, which can be picked up by your healers. The crystals spawn 1 minute and 20 seconds into the encounter, and once picked up, any heals done will be doubled for the rest of the fight or until you pick up another buff. The third buff is called Essence of Dreams. This will spawn 2 green crystals at the edge of the room and can be picked up by the healers. These crystals spawn about 2.5 minutes into the fight and will cause any outgoing heal to be duplicated. The duplicated effect will be split among the entire raid. The fourth buff is called Source of Magic, and this will spawn 2 blue crystals at the edge of the room, which can be picked up by the healers. The crystals spawn about 3.5 minutes into the fight and will double your spell haste while reducing mana costs by 75%, effectively causing you to cast free spells at a very quick pace to keep the raid alive once the damage has started ramping up. The final buff is called Time Loop. It will be applied 5 minutes into the fight to all raid members. Once it's applied, it gives everyone a cheat death mechanic, so if you were to take fatal damage under the influence of the buff, you will simply be brought back to life and the buff is removed. These buffs are fairly straightforward on how to use, since you'll pick up a new crystal once it's spawned and continue with your healing rotation to keep the raid alive. The biggest caveat to this is the first buff, which is applied to the tanks. It should be noted that this buff will only be applied to a tank which is in the correct form or stance, meaning that your warriors need to be in defensive stance, DKs in blood presence, druid in bear form, and so on. So apart from the enabling buffs, what do you actually need to look out for in the fight? Well, realistically, there are only 2 mechanics which needs to be accommodated for. The first mechanic is called Hour of Twilight. This will be used a grand total of 6 times during the fight at a 45-second interval. Once the cast finishes, it will deal very high shadow damage to any player still inside the Twilight realm. To avoid this, you'll simply press your extra action button or macro provided to shift into the normal realm and avoid the damage. However, your raid needs to soak this mechanic with a minimum of 2 players or else Ultraxion will wipe the raid. Once you're hit by the ability, you'll receive a 2-minute debuff which causes you to take fatal damage if you are hit by another Hour of Twilight. So what this does is that it forces your raid to set up a soaking rotation and predetermine who will remain in the Twilight realm and soak the hits. Since there's a 45-second timer between each cast, you can effectively only soak every 3rd cast of Hour of Twilight. It's important to note that any class trying to soak these mechanics needs to have immunities or very hard defensive abilities, since it will still most likely one-shot anyone who has less than 50% damage reduction active on them. So let's take a quick look at which classes can handle this ability effectively. Starting with our tanks, using any 50% damage reduction ability such as IBF, Survival Instincts, Shield Wall will easily make you survive the damage. Other classes that can use immunities to negate the damage, such as Rogues with Cloak, Mage's Ice Block or Cauterize, Paladin's Bubble, Hunter's Deterrence, or Shadow Priest's Dispersion are clear choices to handle this task. If you do not have enough classes to do this, you can also cycle Pain Suppression and Barrier to ensure the survival of a less tanky class. An example of how this could look, using a pretty standard raid composition, would be something like this. The first and the fourth hour of Twilight, your main tank and rogue will take the hits using Cloak and IBF. The second and fifth hour of Twilight will be taken by your off tank and hunter using Deterrence and Survival Instincts. The third hour of Twilight can be taken by your mage and your holy paladin using Ice Block and Bubble. And then the final hour of Twilight can be taken again by your mage using Cauterize and your holy paladin using Divine Protection and Pain Suppression. The second, and strangely enough, final mechanic of this encounter is called Fading Light. The mechanic itself will only affect your DPS and your tanks, but it will require you to be attentive during the raid. Every 10 seconds, Ultraxion will place a debuff on one tank and 2 DPS, where the duration of the debuff will be random between approximately 4 and 8 seconds. Once it expires, you'll die if you're still inside the Twilight Realm, so simply enough, you'll need to press your extra action button to be sent to the normal realm before the expiration. You should remember that you're only sent to the normal realm for 5 seconds when you press your button, so you need to make sure that the debuff duration is less than 5 seconds when you press it. And once the debuff expires, you're automatically forced back into the Twilight Realm. Once brought back, you'll receive the debuff called Faded into Twilight for 5 seconds. This causes your threat to be reset and you're unable to generate new threat for 5 seconds. Naturally, this does not affect the DPS, but the tanks will use this time to taunt swap. So, once your co-tank gets Fading Light, you should simply taunt the boss so that they can safely enter the normal realm and drop their debuff. For all my fellow feral players out there, you'll be able to get the Fading Light debuff at the same time as the main tank if you're in cat form. This can cause you to overlap your debuffs, having to navigate your taunt window with a very tight margin. Additionally, since neither of you will be able to generate any threat, your DPS players can easily get bopped, so if you're not certain of how the mechanic works, you should just stay in bear form to make the fight easy. And that wraps up the Ultraxion 10-man heroic guide. Given the announced nerfs to the raid tier, I'll postpone the final boss guide slightly and prioritize on providing you with some VOD material to give you step-by-step guides on how to finish the first 5 bosses of the tier in the upcoming week or 2. So make sure to drop a subscription so you don't miss out. You should leave a like if you enjoyed the video and comment if you have requests for future guides. See y'all next time.